So earlier this week, judges in Finland dismissed hate speech charges against a politician and a bishop. MP Päivi Räsänen and Bishop Johanna Paula were both put on trial for writing comments about Christianity. Räsänen also tweeted a picture of a Bible verse and had criticised the Lutheran Church for co-sponsoring the Helsinki Pride Parade. They were accused of having hateful beliefs, but after a two-day trial, they walked free. Lorcan Price, who works for ADF International and was part of the legal team that defended Räsänen in Finland, and he joins me now. Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Andrew.
So, Lorcan, can you talk me through this? Because you were in part of the defence team here, and a lot of people won't have heard of this story. They won't know what happened. And I say someone was arrested for quoting the Bible, and they'll think I'm mad. But this did happen, didn't it?
Yes. In 2019 actually, Päivi quoted the Bible in part of a tweet she issued aimed at the leadership of her own church, the Finnish Lutheran Church, criticising their co-sponsorship of the Pride Parade and asking, is this something that the church should be doing? For that, a criminal complaint was made. She was investigated by the police. She was subject to over 10 hours of interrogation under caution. The police initially decided not to go ahead with the charges, but then a new prosecutor general was appointed, and she decided to resurrect the charges, and they went forward to trial.
So is Päivi, I mean, she's coming from a Christian background. Presumably there were religious reasons,
yes,
religious objections.
Yes.
But was it abusive in nature, the tweet?
Well, this is where the key issue in the trial was, because Finnish law prohibits hate speech, and it's kind of under a strange terminology. They call it ethnic agitation. But the view that the prosecutor took was that because the Bible equates homosexual activity with sin and shame, that itself gave rise to hatred, and it incited hatred in the community and was harmful. And of course, what that meant was, in practice, and that the trial became about the question of whether or not these theological concepts could be considered to be essentially criminal because some people may be offended by them, and it may create, the claim of the prosecutor at least, a climate of intolerance.
I mean, does that mean, though, that if this trial would have gone the other way, that even selling a copy of the Bible or the Quran would suddenly become a hateful act?
Well, this is the very question that we were asking. Does it mean then that the police would be called to churches to monitor what pastors or priests are saying? Does it mean that Christians, if they shared a Bible with their colleagues or their friends or their neighbours, could find themselves facing criminal charges? And it's not simply that tweet, though. They went after her for a number of other things as well. She published a document in 2004 about the Christian understanding of marriage and sexuality, a very small document with a very limited publication run. And this was found by an activist who then made a criminal complaint on the basis of that, something written over 16 years ago. And the bishop who was in charge of the Luther Foundation that published it, only a few hundred copies were published, he was charged as well with incitement to hatred for having published it.
I mean, I find it astonishing that anyone would be surprised that Christians would have Christian beliefs.
Well, we were pretty surprised by that as well. The problem really becomes a question then, because we think of Finland as a liberal, democratic, tolerant country, how these hate speech laws are used to shut down the range of things that people can talk about. And then even when it comes to people with religious beliefs that some people may find upsetting or shocking, that they're allowed to freely share them in a democratic society.
Yes.
So this was a really important question for the Finnish judges to deal with.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me is, I've read Paul Coleman's book on hate speech, on censorship, and he reproduces in that book the various hate speech laws throughout Europe. One thing that's very clear is no one can agree what hate speech means. So legally, doesn't that create a problem?
You can say that again. It really, really does, yeah. The problem is we've seen these hate speech laws, and Paul documents this really well in his book Censored, spread across Europe. We now have the European Union potentially getting involved. People here, luckily, in the UK don't have to worry about that anymore, but it's planning to make it a so-called Eurocrime.
A Eurocrime?
A Eurocrime, up there with money laundering, people trafficking, terrorism, and things like that are already in one of the European Union treaties. So because there's no clear definition of hate speech, and even international bodies like the Council of Europe will concede that there is no agreed international law definition of this, it's applied in a very inconsistent way. And the problem with that is, when it comes to sharing your beliefs or saying something controversial, if you're concerned about the possibility of being put through a 2-day criminal trial, hours and hours of police investigation, you're going to probably hold your thoughts. You're going to hold your mouth. You're going
Yes.
to step back from saying something. And that's the chilling effect that you've spoken about before and that we're increasingly aware of in society, where the public square is cleared of all possibly controversial views because people are afraid ultimately of being prosecuted.
So even the fact that you won this case, in a sense, it doesn't matter because we use the phrase, the process is the punishment, but it also sends a signal. It sent a signal to people saying, look, you're going to go through this as well if you dare to express your views. It certainly has, whilst it's not outright censorship, because the verdict went the right way, it does create the conditions within which people will self-censor.
Yes, and that is the problem with hate speech laws. They have the effect, essentially, and this is desired by the people who put them into law, of closing down controversial views. And the European Union is quite clear that that's really what they're after as well in some of their proposals. What I think is important to note, you're quite right, this has been incredibly stressful and costly for Päivi and for Bishop Johanna. I would say watch this space in relation to what happens next, because the prosecutor has indicated that they may appeal the verdict. And remarkably, in Finland, the prosecution has the power to appeal a not guilty verdict. So there could be another round and maybe even more of court proceedings. And it could ultimately end up at the European Court of Human Rights, depending on how it goes.
I mean, I feel with this question of hate speech that it's gone to the point where people just accept the concept. But I don't accept the concept of hate speech. I think hate is a human emotion that shouldn't be audited by the state. And people should be free to say whatever they want without fear of prosecution. But that argument, it feels like people now talk about, well, free speech doesn't mean hate speech. It's just, it's a sort of mantra that's just sort of rattled off.
Yeah.
Has that argument been lost?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I would say no. The European Court of Human Rights, which I think a lot of people may be surprised the UK is still a member of that court, notwithstanding Brexit, because they're separate organisations. But the European Court of Human Rights takes the view that hate speech isn't even entitled to the protection of freedom of expression. But then, on the other hand, as we discussed a moment ago, nobody's quite sure what hate speech is.
Right, so they want to carve out exceptions for hate speech, but they don't know what hate speech is.
Precisely.
Right.
And I would say in the last number of years, things have gotten decisively worse at the European Court, in terms of these cases. They've sided more and more with censorship and closing down of free discussion in the name of hate speech.
And is the problem because people have bought into this idea that if people say mean things, it has a knock-on effect and it ruins society and it leads ultimately to violence? Something which has been disproven again and again.
Exactly. Well, that's the claim that's made. I mean, traditionally in the law, and for a long time, it was an offence to incite violence or to encourage violence. But there's a clear distinction between that and something, as you say, which is an emotion, which is hatred.
Yes.
And somebody may say something that I find disagreeable, but there's no guarantee that I will hate somebody as a result of that. And then even I have to take an additional step then with my hatred into a criminal act before I think the law should become involved. But to censor yourself because of your concern that you may end up being prosecuted means that we're all looking over our shoulders every time we say something possibly controversial. And it really harms the free exchange of ideas in a democracy. And you talk about other cases. I mean, on our website as well, we go into this in some detail, the implications of Päivi's case. And we explain really what's at stake here isn't just relevant for Christians, and of course it is, but more broadly for everyone, irrespective of what view they hold.
But we can look at this and say, well, that's going on in Finland. It isn't possible that someone in the UK could be arrested for quoting the Bible. But there have been preachers who have faced criminalisation for things they've said. That's
correct, yes. Some of those cases are taken under the Public Order Acts, but this government has a number of proposals to close down the right of protest. There's also an online harms bill that they're proposing at the moment as well.
Which they've changed to the online safety bill.
That's correct, sorry, yes. Yeah. So overall, there are a number of provisions in the law in the UK that can act to close down discussion where there's a possibility. And there are racial and religious elements as well too in the criminal law which prohibit what they call stirring up hatred.
Yes, but I mean, that's something that the SNP have introduced in their last hate speech bill, stirring up hatred. But I don't know what they mean by that. It strikes me as a very nebulous idea. And I do know that the Malicious Communications Act, the Electronic Communications Act, it talks about the criteria is that if you say something online that is grossly offensive as opposed to merely offensive. But how can that be anything other than hopelessly subjective? And if it is hopelessly subjective, what's it doing on the statute books?
But that's the problem with these laws, Andrew, and not just in the United Kingdom. In my own country, in the Republic of Ireland, they're planning more hate speech laws. Across Western Europe, Europe more generally, these laws are coming in. And because we don't know exactly what hate speech is, and we don't know where the line between offensive and grossly offensive, and there is case law around this, which we can talk about again, but ultimately, it does really create a lot of uncertainty in the law, and it leads to a situation, as I say, where people are concerned. If I express a view that's controversial on marriage, if I express a view that's controversial on immigration, will I find the police knocking on my door? And that is harmful, as I say, more generally to society.
But is it the case that the reason why we don't see politicians standing up in the Houses of Parliament saying we need to abolish our current existing hate speech laws is because when they do that, there is a fear that people will accuse them of siding with very reactionary people? In other words, we defend everyone's speech, even if we hate the speech that they are saying. But that nuance is not often appreciated.
No, it's not, and that's the problem. If you take a position on this, yes, you're very often accused of being on the right or the far right, and politicians will run from that allegation. And unfortunately, as I say, we can't rely on the courts here either. The problem ultimately is at the highest level in Europe, they have not really been willing to defend freedom of expression. So we're left with, I think, the need for something in this country certainly would be a Freedom of Speech Act, which says, irrespective of all the other areas that speech may be possibly criminalised in the law, that there be strong defences placed in. And I know the government is proposing to reform the Human Rights Act at the moment, and this would be a golden opportunity to strengthen freedom of expression.
So, final question then, are you ultimately optimistic? Because as you say, we're not in the EU, so we don't have those shackles to prevent this from happening. But then I look at our Tory government, and while they say they want to enshrine free speech and have that sort of just as a given, they're also introducing, as you say, the online safety bill, the policing and protesting bill. It looks like they're sort of doing two different things at the same time.
Well, I think hopefully the government here will ultimately see that they're, I think in the DNA, let's say, certainly of their party, but Boris Johnson has written and spoken about this before, that freedom of expression is a cornerstone right. And it's been something that traditionally, British common law has protected in a major way. And if they are reforming the Human Rights Act, or if they want to introduce something entirely new, freedom of speech legislation, I don't think ultimately that they will lose any public support over it. I think increasingly people will expect that they should not be censored and possibly face criminal prosecution for speaking their mind.
Well, that's a very optimistic note to end on. Lorcan Price, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.